Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, People's Panellist, anti-racism campaigner and former Greens candidate Rachael Jacobs. The Liberal MP who led the government's campaign on franking credits, Tim Wilson. Aboriginal activist and Professor of Indigenous Studies at Melbourne University, Marcia Langton. The Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly. And Shadow Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus. Please welcome our panel. And as you may have noticed, French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy has flown back to France, so he couldn't join tonight's panel. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. We hope to include Skype questions from across Australia later, but our first question comes from in the audience from Ruth Mackay.
This is to Tim Wilson. Tim, the Liberal Party just won the unwinnable election that even the secular press acknowledged as a miracle, and it was. But unbeknownst to them, there has been a huge groundswell of united prayer and fasting that has gone across our nation, the whole nation, the likes of which I have never ever witnessed before. Perhaps Israel Folau's sacking influenced some people, but the two major concerns for us were religious freedom being taken away and also the parents' rights being taken away. So my question to you, Tim, is what is the Liberal Party going to do to address these issues?
Tim Wilson.
Well, first, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. I don't think it was an unlosable election or an unwinnable election for any party, and that's been shown clearly, but nonetheless, I'm happy with the result. And
so not an actual miracle, Tim?
It was millions of Australians who came together and voted for the type of country we want to be, and I want to express my thanks to the people of Goldstein for re-electing me as well. But freedom of conscience is core to the Liberal cause. The idea that people should be free to decide how to live their life is a foundation principle of everything I believe in. Now, I know there are many people who are concerned about religious freedom and their freedom to exercise their faith. Sometimes it can be, legitimately threatened, and sometimes people like to rally to causes. As you may know, there was a report commissioned by the previous government or the previous parliament into freedom of religion, and we referred it to the Australian Law Reform Commission to look at how to address some of the tensions that exist in law, because Australian anti-discrimination legislation, which is often the basis of these concerns, was frankly designed at a time where freedom of religion transcended the rights of other minority groups within the community, particularly LGBTI Australians. And I think we need to look and review at that law to improve it so that everybody's rights are protected rather than just trying to tinker with existing laws. So if you're watching from the Australian Law Reform Commission, a different approach and a way at looking comprehensively at change of law is what we're looking for, and that will ultimately decide what we're going to do in terms of reform. Now,
Tim, how soon do you expect the Prime Minister to appoint a Religious Freedom Commissioner, as he's promised to do?
Well, any appointment of any commissioner to the Australian Human Rights Commission has to be done through a piece of legislation. So I don't know the time frames on that, but
would you expect it to be pretty quick, given what Ruth Mackay has just said about the expectations that may have been built up during this campaign from religious communities?
Well, when I was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, I, as part of the package of dealing with human rights issues, included freedom of religion as part of that, as freedom of conscience, as well as freedom of speech, as well as the rights of LGBTI Australians. I think that the existing Human Rights Commissioner can cover those areas in the meantime and make sure they're given voice, but obviously we'll wait and see the legislation.
You'd expect the Prime Minister to deliver on this promise, that's the point?
Well, I'm expecting the Prime Minister to deliver on all of our promises, which covers...
No, that one in particular.
Well, I've just said that, which includes all of our promises and including making sure that currently under federal legislation there's no protection for discrimination on the basis of religion. Okay. That will include that as well.
Let's just quickly go back to Ruth Mackay. Ruth, do you feel there's an expectation that the government will move quickly to do something to protect, in your view, freedom of religion?
I think so. There certainly was an expectation, and it's quite a majority of people out there, and not just Christian people. Other people are concerned about, particularly parents' rights being taken away from them.
OK, the next question is related. I'm going to go to that before I bring in the rest of the panel. It's from Judy Wilkenfeld. Judy.
My question is directed to Mark Dreyfus. Chris Bowen admitted last week that the Labor Party has a serious problem with religious voters. Given Labor's disastrous loss in last week's election, including the loss of votes from faith-based electorates and voters, will the Labor Party be reviewing their current policy of removing the protections in the anti-discrimination legislation that currently protects faith-based organisations and schools?
Go ahead.
Thanks, Judy, for the question. And perhaps the starting point would be to make the point to you that it is a bipartisan commitment to remove the exemption that presently exists for lesbian and gay students in religious schools. It's a promise that Mr Morrison made to the people of Australia during the Wentworth by-election that that exemption would be removed. And it's a promise that, like many promises Mr Morrison's made, he hasn't yet kept. But I'll say this too. The Ruddock Review, which Tim Wilson referred to before but didn't name, concluded that religious freedom in Australia is not in imminent peril. Now, I agree with that conclusion. I don't think that there is any present great risk to religious freedom, notwithstanding a whole lot of fear campaigns that were, along with other fear campaigns, run during this election campaign we've just had. In working with Mr Morrison to remove the exemption for students in religious schools, an exemption that came to light because of the Ruddock Review, and many people around Australia expressed shock that there was such an exemption still in our law, I worked, as is appropriate in my role as Shadow Attorney General, with church leaders, with leaders from mosques and synagogues and leaders of religious schools to make sure that we get this right and that the removal of the exemption is done in an appropriately respectful way.
Okay, you're just on your minute, so I'm going to...
Thanks, Tony. It's a complicated topic, but I want to assure you, Judy, that, and also Ruth, from your question before, that Labor will be working to make sure that there is an appropriate balancing of rights, and we'll be dealing with this in a very, very respectful manner. Now,
during the campaign, you did rule out appointing a Religious Freedom Commissioner. The Prime Minister is going to do that, evidently. Why did you rule it out?
There are already 8 commissioners in the Australian Human Rights Commission, and we didn't feel that it was necessary, particularly in light of the conclusion reached by the Ruddock Review, that religious freedoms, according to Mr Ruddock and his panel, are not in imminent peril.
Paul Kelly.
I think there's a difference here between what Mark Dreyfus has just said and what Chris Bowen said the other day. Chris Bowen's warning was a particularly strong warning. It was a considered warning. He actually said that he felt that faith-based communities believed that progressive politics was no longer working for them. And of course, we know the Labor Party's become a far more progressive party over recent years. We look at the swings against the Labor Party in Queensland, which is a socially conservative state with a lot of religious commitment, as someone like John Black, an election analyst, has pointed out. We look at Western Sydney, where we have a number of ethnically and devout communities. Again, there was a significant swing against the Labor Party there. So I think that essentially what's happened is Chris Bowen has issued a wake-up call to the Labor Party. I think Mark Dreyfus probably doesn't accept that call. He says correctly that the Ruddock Review said that religious freedom was not in peril. Well, at one level that is correct, but I think it's also very clear at another level that many faith-based communities in this country feel that they are under threat, they are under assault. Scott Morrison has said that he will introduce a Religious Discrimination Act. We saw at the end of last year there was a complete deadlock between the Labor Party and the government about how to balance these particular requirements between...
Paul, can I just interrupt you there just to see whether Mark Dreyfus whether the Labor Party, in fact, will change its mind on supporting such legislation? Bear in mind that ahead of the election, the lobby group Christian Schools Australia told parents with kids in such schools the federal election was the most critical for religious freedom in living memory.
Well, Mr Spencer of the Christian Schools Association, I think that's their name, has campaigned mightily for the Liberal Party for many years. He did some more of it at this election. And we don't accept that that's an appropriate way to proceed with a really difficult question. I don't accept what Paul Kelly's just tried to say, that I'm in some argument here with Chris Bowen.
I'm not saying you're in an argument. I'm saying that there's a difference. I'm saying there's a very clear difference of emphasis, it seems to me, between what Chris Bowen said earlier this week and what you just said. Now, I stand to be corrected, but it just seems to me that there is a clear difference of emphasis there.
It's not, well, I'll go back to what Tony's saying. It's not a matter of take it or leave it on a piece of legislation. These are complex questions which require a balancing of rights. We have competing rights here, and all of the international human rights covenants recognise that there are competing rights which need to be balanced. So when the Prime Minister says during the Wentworth by-election he's going to remove an exemption that's been in the Sex Discrimination Act protecting religious schools in respect of lesbian and gay kids in their schools, he's going to remove it. He needs to bring legislation to the Parliament so that it can be debated. He never did.
Let's go to the other side of the panel.
When he does, we'll debate it. We'll debate it in a respectful way, and we'll debate it after consulting with absolutely everybody that's affected.
Rachael, what's your view? You're from Western Sydney, I might point out, and Western Sydney was just one of those areas where a high degree of religious community activism has been seen.
Sure, just to clarify, I work at Western Sydney University. I don't live in Western Sydney, just before anyone goes and fact checks that. So we have laws to protect religious freedom. It's enshrined in the Constitution, actually, so it is one of the strongest protections that we have. And I think it's really important when we talk about religious freedom that we talk about freedom of religious association for all Australians, and including the freedom not to associate with any religion is absolutely fine as well. It's really interesting when you hear about a Religious Freedom Commissioner. I hope that the issue of Islamophobia will be addressed as a result of that, because that's a particular community that's quite vulnerable at the moment. One of our questioners mentioned Israel Folau, and this is a really interesting touchstone for this issue. I think somebody like Israel Folau has demonstrated that he didn't get moved on for his religious views. He got moved on for expressing homophobic views. And there are many people who are religious who play sport, who are in rugby, who are outside of sport as well, who have personal, private views and still uphold the values of today, which is not to spread homophobic comments. And that was where Israel Folau's downfall lay, not that he practiced his religion, but that he expressed a view that was out of step with his employer and out of step with community values, because they hurt a community that is already vulnerable. We know that gay and lesbian, and particularly trans Australians, are more at risk of mental health issues, are more at risk of suicide, because homophobia has been such a scourge in our community. Can I
just put that to Tim? I saw you nodding there, and here's a question: were you offended when Israel Folau said homosexuals, well, hell awaited homosexuals? Precisely what he said.
No, not in the slightest. And, you know, the reality is...
So you don't think it's offensive to...
Oh, I'm sure it's offensive, but was I personally offended? Not at all. I mean, I think Israel Folau, respectfully, is a pretty bad role model. I don't look to sports stars as good role models. In fact, there have been lots of role models in sports who have done, frankly, horrific things at times, between drug and substance abuse, between sexual violence. And while I don't believe he's in that camp, I don't think he's a particularly good role model.
Is it because you don't believe in hell that you're not offended?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, I'm an agnostic person. I'm not a...
So if you're a Christian and homosexual, then the offence might be stronger.
Well, you'd have to ask somebody who's Christian and homosexual, but I'm culturally Christian or Anglican, and even then it doesn't bother me in the slightest, because he has a right to express his view. The issue he has is, and it's a complex one, because there are issues around his contract and how it managed him, the commitments he made that he wouldn't repeat his pre-existing comments again. And I have general concerns both about how he conducts himself and, frankly, how Rugby Australia is conducted.
But you don't think there should be legislation to stop people saying what he said?
No.
OK. Marcia, what do you think generally about this issue? Religious freedom, the potential of the Prime Minister bringing in a Religious Freedom Commissioner, is it necessary?
I don't think it's necessary. I don't think religious freedom's imperilled in this country at all. On Israel Folau, it's a it's a matter of contract law. He breached his contract, and his employer is entitled to dismiss him on the grounds that he breached his contract. He knew very well what his contract said, and I don't know why he thinks he should be exempt from his employment contract on the grounds of religion. So you see where this argument goes. Freedom of religion does not mean the freedom to persecute others. Freedom of religion does not mean the freedom to discriminate against others. And I think many Australians think freedom of religion means precisely that, the freedom to discriminate. And, you know, all this stuff about parents' rights, I find it very worrying that there's, you know, a tinge of hysteria in the campaign to prevent education in schools to stop bullying. Bullying in schools has caused suicides. Now, and when it comes to homophobic bullying, we know just how damaging that is. We have a lot of information about that now. And any attempt to stop education to prevent bullying, I think, is an attack on freedom. It's the freedom of the victims who have to be considered in this case, not the freedom of those who want to discriminate and bully and harass children to death. I think the debate is hysterical in many parts of the country, and I don't accept the premise of the definition of freedom that's being floated here. I just don't accept it.
Paul, just come back to you very briefly. The debate's hysterical, says Marcia. Others disagree with your position. What do you think about that? I mean, how seriously should the Prime Minister pursue this, given what we're hearing from representatives of some religious communities?
Well, the Prime Minister's made a commitment. He will pursue it. This follows the Ruddock Review.
Mind you, the Ruddock Review did not recommend a Religious Freedom Commissioner. That's something that's just come out of the blue.
Sure. I mean, I think that we don't really have much of a debate about this issue at all. I think that a lot of people concerned about an assault on their faith or pressure on their faith are not speaking out about this. What we've seen in more recent times, of course, is we've seen senior representatives from the Christian churches and Christian schools going public and making comments and expressing their concern. So there's no doubt there is a problem. They feel under siege. Now, you can have a debate about whether they're exaggerating the problem or not, but there's no doubt that a lot of the religious institutions and people of religious faith feel that they are under pressure. Some of them feel that they are under siege. And this is a very difficult debate because it's about competing rights. So we need to have a calm and rational debate. We need to have a respectful debate. I hope we do have that debate, but I mean, essentially what's going to happen is the Prime Minister will proceed with his commitment to introduce a religious discrimination bill to try and get the balance right. But I think the final point to make is the Senate committee highlighted a couple of years ago, protections for religious freedom in this country are conspicuously weak.
OK. Let's move on and watch that space. The next question comes via Skype. It's from Brittany Searle in Campbelltown, New South Wales.
Hello. My question is, as a nation, we pride ourselves on freedom of speech and democracy, yet voting Liberal has resulted in so much shame from the typical left. I voted Liberal because Labor Party policies were going to completely threaten my financial position and that of my family. Not because I loved Liberal policies, but because I hated Labor's. Yet, in order to do so, I was made to feel as though I'd turned my back on the environment and humanity as a whole. So my question is, why is politics so full of anger and shaming these days?
Thank you, Brittany. We might come back to you in a minute. OK, Rachael, what do you think? Do you feel that young people who voted Liberal have been shamed in sections of the media, on social media in particular?
Well, firstly, thank you, Tony. We pride ourselves on a really robust democracy, but we also pride ourselves that our political debate should be civil and respectful, and so I'm sorry that the questioner does feel that they're being disrespected by some members of the community, and I imagine a lot of that's going on the internet. We know the internet is not real life, that people are generally more, I hope, more respectful in day-to-day life. I've got some experience with that. But anyway, I think one of the reasons why our questioner might feel some anger directed towards her is because what we're facing for the next 3 years is going to be complete inaction on climate change, is going to be an extension of more tax breaks for millionaires, is going to be more of the African gangs used as scapegoats. And so you can understand why this makes people quite angry. You can understand why people get quite emotional around these issues, because they were so hoping for progress. They were so hoping to shift some of that negativity, and they were so hoping to make progress on the big ideas. It is a big letdown,
okay,
you know, on that. And
I'm going to hold you up there because
I just want to mention that the questioner is not the enemy. You know, that's.
Well, let's go back. Let's go back to Brittany if we can, if she's still there. Are you still there, Brittany?
I am.
Yeah. So can you point out where it is that you were or felt shamed? Was that on social media? Was it on the internet? Was it on television?
It was often on social media. Yeah, it was often on social media, but it's not confined to social media at all. I have a few friends who are quite open about, you know, wanting to discuss it, and not so much discuss it, to yell it at me, really. And I've had a lot of interactions with people who have found the need to yell their views at me because of the belief that climate change, there will be inaction on climate change, and there will be all these.
All right, let's go around our non-yelly panel, and we'll start with Tim. What do you think? I mean, that's a very interesting perspective, and clearly not every young person has decided that you know, a change of government was the way. Many obviously voted for the coalition.
Well, I feel sorry for Brittany. I mean, democracy is about choice, and people have a right to be able to express their view at the ballot box about what they want for their country, for themselves, for their family, for their community. But the reality is there are some people who are just bullies, and when they don't tolerate people having different frameworks of thinking or different priorities. And you see a lot of that in social media, particularly from extreme voices on the left who do bully people. Now, there are extreme voices on the far right too, I'm not trying to pretend otherwise, but who don't tolerate a diversity of opinion. And that's where it comes from. But it also comes from dishonesty, where people repeat things like, oh, there will be no action on climate change, even though we're meeting our Kyoto targets, smashing them. In fact, we'll be meeting our Paris targets, and we have a comprehensive plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as part of this government, and we'll continue to implement them, like the Snowy 2.0 project, like record investment in renewables. So when people put out misinformation or deceive the public, then obviously it's going to prompt people to become angry about the choices when they're misled about the consequences.
We might come back to the misinformation issue
Sure.
a bit later. Marcia, what do you think? You actually put aside partisan politics to a large degree when you thought it was a very important thing to align yourselves with mining companies who were offering jobs to Indigenous people, and that wasn't exactly a smooth road for you.
And I suffered years of abuse for it. Yeah. And, you know, defamation, if, you know, of course I didn't have the money to take a defamation case against a journalist at Crikey and a few others. I was pilloried on social media. My research work was lied about. And, you know, it just went on for years.
Does it give you some sympathy for young
I have a lot of
voters
sympathy.
like
I have a lot of sympathy for Brittany. I think there is an incivility in our politics, an increasing incivility. And it's a pretty stupid position to take. So, yeah, sure, I feel like swearing at people and, you know, getting angry about some issues. But in debating with others some very important issues, it's important, I think, to be rational and to debate others in order to be persuasive and reach a better outcome. So I'm terribly disappointed that we won't have Bill Shorten's promise of a referendum in this term of government. I'm terribly disappointed that we won't have an end to the community development project that was promised by Bill Shorten and Patrick Dodson. I'm very disappointed about a number of things. But here's the thing, I can't even remember how many governments I've lived through now, but when you're dealing with the crisis that the Indigenous world faces, you have to just bite your lip and try to be partisan in between the elections and work with each government to improve the situation. So a lot of young people are terrified about climate change, and yes, they have good reason to be afraid. However, what they really need to do now is put the pressure on the right people, not on Brittany and not on other people who voted in a way that makes them unhappy. I can't go and abuse people for voting for the Liberal Party because now the Indigenous world will be trapped in the community development project. We probably won't get our referendum on the Uluru Statement.
We're going to come back and talk specifically about that in a moment, Marcia. So I'll just pass around to the other panellists. And Mark Dreyfus, I mean, here we go. You assumed, I think Labor assumed that, you know, the vast number of young people would vote Labor because you assumed they're more progressive. Clearly, not everyone's thinking that way.
I didn't make any assumptions about the way anybody was going to vote, but there was a very deep expectation across Australia that Labor would win the election. And the result has been a shock to very many Australians, a shock to Liberals as well as to Labor people. But I'd say to Brittany, I absolutely deplore personal attacks on you for the way you voted. And I think Marcia hit the nail on the head just a moment ago by saying the pressure needs to be put on the government that's been elected. Those people who are disappointed in the result know what they've got to do. They've got to dust themselves off and they've got to take the fight up. That's what Labor's going to be doing to the government that's been elected to get proper action on climate change. I happen to think that there's a climate emergency, but I'm not going to attack Brittany because you voted for other reasons. I'm going to keep the pressure on the government to make sure we get real action on climate change and a whole range of other things like the referendum on an Indigenous voice or all of the other things that we campaigned on that the government doesn't seem likely it's going to do. But we must get away from this politics of personalised attack. We've got to try to have a contest of ideas.
Paul Kelly.
Well, there's far too much bullying and personal attacks in our political debate, and a lot of that comes off social media. I think one of the unfortunate results from this election is that the divisions in this country on climate change are getting deeper. And this was a fascinating election because essentially you've got a very significant difference in policy between the government and the Labor Party. And Bill Shorten essentially tried to fundamentally change the politics of climate change because he said, I'm not going to tell you the cost because we've now passed a new threshold. And the threshold we've passed is we've got to the point where it's more important to take action rather than not take action. To talk about costs is dishonest. We're not going to do it. Now, clearly that didn't work. That didn't work. But essentially you've got one group of people, particularly on the progressive side, particularly on the radical progressive side, who say, what's the issue here is the future of human civilisation, human survival. Now, once you accept that argument, and the science leads you to that argument, then a lot of very radical measures are justified, including possibly suspension of some form of democratic process over the course of the next 10 years if, in fact, democratic governments are not responding to what you think is the problem.
I'm going to throw straight across the panel to Rachael. I mean, I haven't heard anyone suggesting a suspension of democratic process, but Paul, you obviously fear that.
Well, I'm not suggesting that anyone is proposing that. I'm talking about the logic of this situation.
All right.
If you look at the logic of the radical groups abroad...
Let's hear from Rachael first.
Well, part of the logic is that we've just been told that we've got 11 years until the catastrophic effects of climate change take hold. So we're kind of keen to get started. That would be why. So we've been told that a 2-degree increase is imminent. And one of the problems is it's not in the interests of the government or the opposition to tell us what that means. A 2-degree increase means there will be no reef. We've heard that 1 million species are being threatened with extinction. The number is so great that it is beyond comprehension. So we've moved a little bit beyond Brittany's question now, which is absolutely fine. But what I will say is that Brittany and anybody who voted Liberal is not the enemy. Where we need to be focusing our energies is, and I think one of the things that Marcia was mentioning is the best way to bring people around to an argument is certainly not by yelling at them. Respectful debate.
Can I just very quickly throw that point to Mark Dreyfus? As Anthony Albanese seems to indicate that he might be prepared to cooperate with Scott Morrison on this issue in particular. Do you think there's time now, it's time now for both sides to actually come to some sort of coordinated and agreed position?
We've been trying to reach a coordinated and agreed position with the Liberal Party now for over a decade. I actually thought we might have got there in 2007 because John Howard supported a carbon price in 2007. So it's been a really, really long project. Of course, Anthony Albanese, our new leader, has indicated a willingness to cooperate, just as, and this goes to Brittany's point, he's indicated an absolute preparedness and a willingness and a wish to reach out to the people that did not vote for Labor. So you can expect to be hearing from Anthony Albanese and Labor. Brittany, we want your vote at the next election. OK,
I'm just going to go back to Brittany. Any chance you might change your mind come the next election? Are you a swing voter or you... Yep.
I'm always going to change my mind in an election. It's about who has the best policies, not about who's the best person or what my personal beliefs are. It's about who has the best policies and whether or not they work for me.
All to play for. OK, the next question is from Michael Tice.
My question is for Tim Wilson. Tim, you were accused of running a scare campaign regarding Labor's retiree tax. First, what do you think of that allegation? And second, how important do you consider the public opposition to the tax proved to be for the government's re-election?
Tim Wilson.
Firstly, I know Michael before anybody wants to go on Twitter and find out that we're actually Facebook friends. Well, I mean, the reality is, I don't know how anyone can call it a scare campaign. It was a parliamentary inquiry which gave ordinary Australians a voice to have their opinion about the issue. If there were a change of government on the 1st of July of this year, many Australian retirees would lose up to 1/3 of their income overnight without any consultation, without any input in legislation, or without any consequence of mind of the impact it would have on them.
But a parliamentary inquiry on an opposition policy is quite unusual, right?
Well, actually, no. In the last piece of legislation, what was referred to the Economics Committee in the last Parliament was from a crossbencher. So we look at legislation proposals all the time. What this inquiry did was gave ordinary Australians a voice. Now, let's not be under any illusion about what happened. Firstly, Labor Party tried to make all sorts of allegations against me and try and bully me out of the job. I don't mind, doesn't bother me the slightest. But they also then said to all of those Australian retirees who stood up, well, don't vote for us, and arrogantly dismissed their concerns. They've now come back and admitted, well, maybe it actually does have an impact on a lot of people on low incomes. Maybe we should have listened, and they've paid an incredibly high price.
It's not literally a retiree's tax, though, is it?
Yes,
it is.
It is. Well, hang on.
Well, let's get the... Well, I'll just get Labor's...
Let me just answer this, because it's one of the
again.
greatest bits of misinformation. You get a tax credit if you've paid tax. If you remove the credit, you only have tax.
OK, well, let's hear Labor's position on that, because you deny it's a tax. Why?
Well, I'm glad Tim didn't try to explain it. It's a nonsensical position that's been adopted by Tim at a whole lot of levels. It was never a retiree tax.
Yes, it
was.
But
Tim, keen to have the last word. Tim was reprimanded by the Speaker of the House of Representatives for his misuse of the parliamentary committee process, and on any view, it was a misuse of the parliamentary committee process.
Would you agree? Well, leave aside the parliamentary committee issue for a moment. Would you agree, at least, that it was a financial impost on many retirees?
Of course, it was a removal of a benefit or a subsidy that is paid by the Australian Tax Office using other taxpayers' money.
But obviously...
About 3%, Tony,
right,
of Australian taxpayers.
Well, 3% who were on it, and how many percent were waiting to use that system, and how many relatives of people who had the system? I mean,
sure.
You're not seriously considering continuing with the policy, are you?
I'm not going to commit to what our final position's going to, what our future position's going to be, because we are a collective party and we are going to be talking to each other about where we will go in relation to that and other policies. But the Liberal Party...
wouldn't want to lay a bet on keeping that policy, would you?
The form, I'm not going to commit to what form it might take. We made it clear, for example, that it will not apply to part pensioners or pensioners, but that didn't stop literally hundreds of people coming up to me in the street and talk to me who were pensioners or part pensioners who, because of the false scare campaign run by Tim Wilson and his colleagues, thought that they were going to be affected. This was a campaign where the Liberal Party campaigned on imagined Labor Party policies that we did not have and still have no shame about it. It wasn't a retiree tax. Yes. Tim knows that. He's still going on with the same false statement, having conspired with his relative, the other Wilson, the real estate agent, to use the names of people participating in a parliamentary inquiry for Liberal Party purposes, breaching their privacy, and he still apparently...
That's a lie.
He still apparently has no shame about it.
OK, sorry, I've got to give you a right of reply. Brief one, go ahead.
Firstly, I'm absolutely very proud of the inquiry we ran because we gave Australians a voice. And the reality is, all you have done at every point is misinform or mislead the Australian people, Mark. But, the reality is, it isn't going to be legislated anymore. It's done. You didn't listen and you paid a price. That's why you got the word
OK, all right. We'll leave that there with the politicians. The next question comes from Rebecca Jones. Rebecca.
So it's amazing that finally in 2019 we have Ken Wyatt, who's the first Indigenous Minister of Indigenous Australians. Does this mean that Scott Morrison is willing to hold a referendum to implement an enshrined Indigenous voice to Parliament within this term, or is he going to hold on to that referendum as a bargaining chip for a future election?
Marcia Langton, what do you think?
Well, I have no idea. I can't read the entrails on this one. There have been a few statements, Rebecca, and I think Tim is required to answer this question. I'd like to know the answer to your question too.
We'll bring in Tim for a minute, but I mean, the Prime Minister today announced, but with no details, a new Indigenous Australians agency inside Prime Minister and Cabinet, reporting outside Prime Minister and Cabinet to Ken Wyatt, which is an odd way of doing it. You might think it would be in Ken Wyatt's department, but it isn't. Do you think he's trying to establish a kind of his own version of the Indigenous voice?
That's a very good question. It's a question I want an answer to also. And if the answer is yes, that's a very unsatisfactory arrangement. There should be such consultative arrangements in any case, but it is not what we are asking for in the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
We'll come back to you on the referendum question. Let's hear Tim on this whole question of what the Prime Minister's talking about today when he's referring to a new Indigenous Australians agency inside Prime Minister and Cabinet. There already is, Malcolm Turnbull brought in an advisory body of Indigenous people. Is this to supplant that? Are they going to operate together? Is this something different?
Well, this was a matter that was announced yesterday, and so the details that the government has admitted are going to be released in time. But I think there's, particularly around service provision, the opportunity for consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It's fundamentally critical because our position has been we want, in the words of Noel Pearson, the freedom for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to be able to take responsibility. Stan Grant wrote an excellent article today about his excitement about what can be achieved under this government because the focus is on how we can empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
But one of the things he was saying was he was wondering whether Prime Minister Morrison would now be perhaps open to the idea of an Indigenous voice.
Well, I think Well, I know
that was already ruled out by Prime Minister Turnbull, but do you think this Prime Minister might think again?
What we don't have is a proposal that's ready to be put to the Australian people. We have statements of objective and principle that's put forward by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And as someone who's had their own relationship put to the ballot to the Australian people to judge, one of the things that I would hope that no matter what side of politics you're on, you do not want a proposal that's going to be put to the Australian people that doesn't have a very high degree of chance of success.
Why couldn't you establish a referendum in this term of Parliament? Why? Because I think it's already been ruled out.
Well, no, we can't do anything. We can't put forward a referendum until we actually have a proposal. I'm not going to set a deadline when we don't actually have a proposal to put forward that people can come to common agreement on. And as I said, if
but 3 years not enough time, is that the point?
Well, this process has gone on well beyond 3 years
That's
already,
right.
and we're trying to get to a proposal that can share the common agreement that can be successful. And there's been about 4 or 5 different proposals at each point. So I won't support the idea of putting a proposal that won't be successful, because I think the scars it would leave to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders just for an amber deadline would be far greater than we can possibly
OK, I said I'd come back to Marcia on the referendum question. It has been pretty much ruled out for this term of Parliament. Can you see any reason why it couldn't be done by a determined government?
No. I think that the question is the least of our problems. The questions could be, drafted by a few people here in this room right now. It's not that difficult. And the question is whether or not the government would accept the question that we would find that we propose is the question to put to the people. We've had so many propositions already. Tim's already said that. And each one of them has been rejected by this party or that party. So you'll remember the expert panel on constitutional recognition, entirely dismissed in the most offhand way. And then there were subsequent inquiries. And again, there were, these very informal doorstop dismissals of very important ideas. And, you could just tell that most people didn't know what they were talking about. So one politician would say, no, we're not going to have that. Another politician would say, no, we're not going to have that. Well, how would they know? It was so evident to me that none of them had ever read any of the reports all the way through or understood the basic dilemma here. So really, I have to say the only way through this problem is what is proposed in the Uluru Statement. It resolves the dilemma. It's actually a very conservative constitutional solution to the problem. And anybody who understands the Constitution would agree with that, and they already have. So, Anne Toomey, name your favourite conservative constitutional lawyer, they all agree this is an elegant way through the problem.
Let's go to the Shadows Attorney-General, because the Labor had a strong position on this. You were going to actually push ahead with the referendum and favoured the Indigenous voice to Parliament.
That's right, Tony. And to go back to Rebecca's question, which was about how to make this referendum happen, we did commit at the election to doing a referendum for the voice from the Uluru Statement from the heart in the next term of Parliament. We think it is possible to do it in the next term of Parliament. Tony, you made the point that Malcolm Turnbull rejected it out of hand. Mr Morrison has at least accepted that it should happen. It's just that he's not prepared to put a timetable on it. We think he should. We think if you want to make something happen, you've got to put a timetable on it. And I just go back to something Anthony Albanese said at his press conference today. Today is the 52nd anniversary of the famous 1967 referendum. And that changed Australia. That referendum changed for the good the relationship between Indigenous people and the other people of Australia.
Okay.
And that's why we want to go to this referendum too. And I'm very much hoping that Mr Morrison will get in his heart to a position where we can do it in the next term of Parliament.
Paul Kelly, can you see any reason why it couldn't be made to happen in this term of Parliament? And by a powerful Prime Minister who's established his own authority, if Scott Morrison wanted to do this? Could he not simply make it happen?
Tony, I think this is a very fraught issue. Scott Morrison clearly wants to develop his own approach as Prime Minister, and that will involve yet another round of engagement and consultation, even though we've had a lot over the course of, the last half dozen years. I think there are two fundamental issues here in terms of getting this referendum up. The first one is, I think, and many people disagree, the voice must be defined. I think you cannot put a referendum to the Australian people about putting a voice to the Parliament in the Constitution without the Australian people knowing what is the nature of the voice, how does it operate, how does it function, what does it mean, what is its purpose. And unless it's defined, then I don't believe that the public will vote for it.
Paul, do you agree that it's impossible to even have that debate if for example, the first Prime Minister we were talking about, Malcolm Turnbull, ruled it out categorically, without a debate, without a discussion, without a national conversation about how it might work?
Well, we should have that national conversation.
So would you call on Scott Morrison to begin that national conversation?
Well, I think we should have the national conversation, yes. But the point I would make is that the decision taken by Malcolm Turnbull was a decision of the Turnbull cabinet. Scott Morrison was a member of that cabinet, and I personally think the decision by the Turnbull cabinet to reject the voice to Parliament reflected the overwhelming sentiment within the Liberal and National parties. Now, Tim might disagree with that, but I do think there is a difficulty here. The voice must be defined before any referendum is put, and secondly, the Australian people must be convinced that this proposal will unite the country, not lead to separation and division.
Rachael.
I think it's really sad and disappointing that once again our First Nations people are being made to wait. I mean, how much longer? It's really, really saddening, because this could have been something that defined our generation, like 1967. Instead, what we've got is inaction and delay. And as we can see, Australians have a hunger for reconciliation, and we've seen this from years, from the walk over the bridge, to the way Australians embrace the apology, to in recent years the majority of Australians looking to change the date. So there is certainly an attitude to get on board. And so to pretend that we need to wait for the right question for Australians to get on board, I think is a bit of a furphy.
Yeah, we've got a specific question on this for Marcia. It's from Jennifer Knox.
Yes, my question is for Marcia Langton. The Uluru Statement from the Heart sends a really powerful message, but many Australian people do not regularly come in contact with Indigenous folk, and so don't have the experience of their lives in a day-to-day fashion explained to them. How would you suggest, in practical measures, could a community group in an overwhelmingly non-Indigenous community work to raise support for the referendum to have the voice enshrined in the Constitution?
Marcia.
So, well, there are a number of ways. One is Reconciliation Australia. And so I think this week is Reconciliation Week. I've been out bush. I'm not sure exactly when it started. Did it start yesterday? Today? And so there are reconciliation groups around the country and activities, and they are very well connected with the Voice Treaty Truth campaign, and also with the our health, Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, who are, I think today, called for truth-telling to be part of the process. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart has three proposals: the Voice, a Makarrata Commission for treaties, and also truth-telling. And I think that all of our organisations are participating in education activities towards this end. So And there'll be a lot more as well. And you can look forward later this year to a book by Thomas Mayer on the Uluru Statement from the Heart and his campaign to educate people about what it means. He took the statement and the painting in which it's embedded around the country to thousands of people. So there is a lot of work being done. Your workplace or your community group could invite somebody to come and talk to you about it. So I don't know personally any Indigenous people who are opposed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, except for those who haven't actually explicitly stated their position. And, you know, I'm not going to bully them and demand that they tell me what it is. So most of the people that I know are firmly in favour of it. And on the question of a clear definition of what the voice means, I'm sure that you've all suspected that we have a very clear idea ourselves of what it should look like, and that our best and brightest have actually designed it. You'll remember, Paul, that Noel Pearson wrote an essay published as a quarterly essay, and I'm just trying to think of the name of it.
We don't need the name at the moment, but
in that essay, I think he made it abundantly clear what the voice would look like. People say, oh, we don't know what it would look like. I refer you to Noel Pearson's essay on it. Now, you might want your lawyers to, you know, number the paragraphs and put some colons in and propose which clause it might be in the Constitution. But I'm pretty sure that people that we know have done that work, but they're anxious about exposing what's very clear to us to the naysayers who will immediately run a no campaign and cause a referendum to fail. I know that you'll say, but the question has to come out sooner or later. But what we need to do, I think, first is to bring enough people along on the logic of the proposition before we are drowned in the typical incivility of debate about Indigenous affairs and, you know, lies told, exaggerations
Do you feel
made.
there's a small moment now, a little interregnum period where that might all change?
Yeah, I think, strangely enough, ironically enough, we have an opportunity to persuade people of the logic of this proposition and to take away the fear. There's this, you know, nonsense question out there. Well, if Aborigines are going to be in the Constitution, what about me? Why don't I get mentioned in the Constitution? So, you know, what most people don't understand is that the Constitution is supposed to be for all Australians except Aborigines.
Okay.
We are the gaping hole in the heart of the Constitution, and they don't understand why. We have to explain that logic to them.
OK, Noel Pearson's essay, quarterly essay, is called A Rightful Place. Put it in your library, check it out, read the detail. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Dane Stern.
Jews are recognised by the federal government as facing greater security challenges than the general population, with security guards outside Jewish schools, communal buildings and places of worship. Jews face a dual threat from both the far right and from extreme Islamists. Only last week, an ISIS supporter in Sydney, Issas Khan, told a sentencing hearing, "I was planning on using a knife on Jewish students in Sydney University to kill them. Just people wearing the headgear, the kippah." How do you explain the upsurge in racism generally, and in particular anti-Semitism, across Western nations like Australia, and how should we be tackling the problem?
Mark Dreyfus, start with you.
Anti-Semitism, of course, is just another form of racism, and it's shocking wherever it arises. It's really troubling to me. It should be really troubling to us all that we've had a rise in racism and a rise in anti-Semitism in our country.
And globally.
And globally. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. It comes from extremism. Extremism on the far right, extremism in the form of Islamist extremism, and extremism sometimes on the far left. And I think...
You're talking about Jeremy Corbyn there?
No, I'm not talking... I'm not singling anyone out.
That's what he's been accused of in the United Kingdom,
well,
as you know.
He has been accused of anti-Semitism, and so have accusations been made against the British Labor Party, which I deplore and would like to assure absolutely everybody have nothing to do with the Australian Labor Party. But putting Mr Corbyn to one side, the duty of all Australian leaders and of everybody in any position in our community is to speak out against racism in all its forms, to speak out against anti-Semitism. And I think we can work harder on campaigns against anti-Semitism and against racism. Campaigns work, leadership works in this area, and to quote Mr Morrison, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And or something like that. I might not have got that quite right, but it's very, very important that everybody in a position of leadership speak up. I don't want to continue to see a situation where Jewish schools and Jewish institutions in our country require additional physical security and require security guards that is appropriately funded by the Commonwealth Government, but I wish we didn't need it. And so too, I don't like to see discrimination against members of our Islamic community. I don't like to see, and I don't want to see, any further discrimination in our country, be it racist discrimination or other forms of discrimination. We've got to do whatever we can to deal with it, but it is something that has to come from the top.
Rachael.
All forms of racism are abhorrent. Anti-Semitism is abhorrent, and it is sadly on the rise. This is a worldwide phenomenon that aligns to the rise of the far right, and it is really, really worrying. And there are two things going on here. Firstly, as society is becoming more equal and progress is being made, there are some people who cling to power in more and more extreme ways. They become attracted to far-right groups and they start to dig their heels in. But the other thing going on is that we have a government that fans the flames of racism. In the last parliament, and Tim's going to disagree with me here, but just look at the last parliament. We had Pauline Hanson in a burqa. We had the words final solution uttered in Parliament. We had talk of it's okay to be white, which translates to it's okay to be a racist, is the message that people pick up. And this is the rise of Hansonism as well. So it's not some fringe groups that exist in the shadows and things like that. This is right in front of our face. And then we wonder why we see the rise of anti-Semitism. Then we wonder why we see the rise of racism and day-to-day casual and structural racism as well. So if we need to start anywhere, we need to start with our leadership and we need to call our leadership out. Mark, you're absolutely right about calling leadership out, but let's start at the highest levels of office, which indeed is with our Prime Minister.
Tim.
Well, I actually want to agree with Mark because the reality is we all have a responsibility to stand up and call out racism. That's the responsibility of free speech. But I think we have to acknowledge that it exists across the entire political extremism and political spectrum. It's both on the far left and the far right. We have the Greens, for instance, supporting BDS motions in New South Wales, which is a direct attack on the Jewish community. We have extreme...
So, Tim, I'm going to need to jump in there.
Well, I know, but considering the slight you just took against the Prime Minister without any substance...
There is a marked difference.
And you endorse a campaign of the Greens in New South Wales endorse a campaign deliberately targeted at slighting Israel through the BDS motion.
So firstly, I don't actually think that's Green policy at the moment. I'm happy to be corrected if I am not true. But boycotts are not about anti-Semitism.
Well, when they only target one
racism.
country, they kind of are.
It is...
Okay. When they only target one country...
Well, it is about targeting an Israeli state that is inflicting an apartheid regime on...
There we go.
OK, well, you can jeer all you want, but Palestinians have the right to live and go about their lives, as do Israelis.
Okay.
And that's what...
And I need to say very directly, Tony, Israel is not an apartheid state.
So...
And
That was okay. That's one of the first times we've ever heard a comment in stereo on this program.
Okay.
But actually, I want to bring in. I'm going to bring in Marcia, who's been sitting here listening to this. And what do you think?
Well, I don't understand why Australia didn't, just as Europe did many years ago, make it a criminal offence to deny the Holocaust. So when I saw those lunatic fascists in Melbourne on St Kilda Beach giving the Heil Hitler salute in our city.
Wasn't Fraser Anning with them?
And Fraser Anning was with them. I was just enraged that there is no law to stop that. The police, you know, were there. There was a counter-protest, but it just should be illegal. And then they daubed anti-Semitic filth all over the walls around the suburb, including on a Jewish old people's home. Imagine how terrifying that would be for the people in that old people's home. And, you know, this kind of thing now is going on regularly. I worked for months with, as sort of backup support to Nyadol Nguyen's campaign to stop, you know, an extreme right-winger, and I would say fascist, from getting a visa to come to Australia. And Nyadol obtained over 50,000 signatures. It was probably closer to 100,000 signatures to stop undesirables from entering this country and spreading this right-wing extremism, this racist extremism. And it took the good offices of Mark Dreyfus as the Shadow Attorney General to give us the support to, you know, get into Parliament. And eventually there was a positive resolution. The visas were not issued. But when our senators voted for Pauline Hanson's idiotic resolution, "It's okay to be white," which is a Ku Klux Klan slogan, I felt sick and I started to lose hope. I thought, how can apparently intelligent people vote for that resolution? I was so disgusted. And, you know, just look at the list of people who voted for that resolution. It's shocking. It's absolutely deeply, deeply shocking. And you know, to this day, I have to say I'm going to find it very, very difficult to be civil to the people who voted for that resolution in the Senate. And this movement has brought disgrace to our Parliament. This filth is in our Parliament, and there's barely an objection. You know, what is this? Why didn't the people responsible in Parliament put a halt to this? How could anybody let Pauline Hanson's resolution go through to the Senate chamber? How could that happen? So I think, really, the whole of Australia needs to be re-educated, and the government had better start doing it. Do you know there are young Australians in school who don't know what the Holocaust is? They don't know anything about it. Most people don't know about the Genocide Convention. They don't know about the Nuremberg trials. And, you know, I could go on and on. I would like to see the government take these issues much more seriously, and I would like to see the responsible members of our Parliament take the issue seriously enough to refuse to play games like giving visas to provocateurs who bring this Nazi filth into our country. I want that to stop.
Okay. I'm sorry to say, and we'll leave it on those ringing comments, because that is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Rachael Jacobs, Tim Wilson, Marcia Langton, Paul Kelly and Mark Dreyfus. Thank you very much. You can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by the President of Torrens University, Linda Brown. Next week, Q&A is live from Melbourne with working class boy, then working class man turned rock and roll author Jimmy Barnes. South African-Australian Sisonke Simang, whose latest book aims to reclaim the political legacy of Winnie Mandela. The new Minister for the Environment, Susan Lee, and Labor MP Joel Fitzgibbon, who was quick to criticise his own party for losing touch with regional and rural voters. Until then, good night.